Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session, Strengthening Security in Multifamily Housing. The session today will explore the principles of crime prevention through environmental design, referred to as CPTED, and how these strategies can be applied within multifamily housing communities. We'll also hear a real-world example from a housing authority that has successfully implemented these methods to enhance safety and reduce crime on their properties. We're grateful to have a few different speakers with us today. We have Hector Rodriguez and Craig Gundry from Critical Intervention Services, which is a Florida-based firm with over 30 years of experience helping organizations manage complex security challenges. Craig serves as the Vice President of Special Projects. He's a board-certified physical security professional and Florida CPTED practitioner. He's a court-approved security expert witness and has authored numerous articles on physical security matters. He also provides expert commentary for both national and local news outlets and has extensive experience as an educational instructor in various capacities. Hector is the Assistant Vice President of Special Projects. He's a board-certified expert in security management and is also a Florida CPTED practitioner. He has over 20 years of experience in rehabilitating high-crime communities, designing physical security systems, emergency management, and premise liability. He's also a court-approved expert security witness and is a respected speaker and educator on security-related subjects. We also have representatives from West Palm Beach Housing Authority with us today. Leon Lipsick is the Director of Risk Control and Program Compliance, and Michael McManaman is the Director of Contract and Insurance Compliance. West Palm Beach Housing is in the process of bringing their properties into compliance with the recent Florida statute that offers liability protection to multifamily housing owners against third-party criminal activity, which the session will touch on today. And we'll be hearing from Leon and Michael later on in the session where they'll talk about a large redevelopment project they worked on and how they integrated CPTED principles into the site. Before we begin, I do want to highlight that our risk control team here at HAI Group has just released a comprehensive guide titled Housing Security and Law Enforcement Operations. This resource provides practical guidance on crime prevention, building community trust, and developing partnerships with law enforcement. You could download this directly from our resource center at haigroup.com. We're really excited for today's discussion, and we encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature, and we will address these towards the end of the session. So with that, I will turn it over to Craig and Hector to get us started.
Greetings. Thank you very much. Before we kind of begin, I realize that amongst the audience watching this program, there's probably different levels of experience as it relates to this issue of crime prevention through environmental design. So I don't want to really waste anybody's time by discussing academic principles and the history of CPTED and how this all kind of develops from the broken windows theory and things like this. Instead, just kind of look at what this is strategically as it would apply to mitigating risk for our types of properties, and then also practical strategies and practical issues that often arise in CPTED, both in practice as well as in improvement of existing properties. Now, CPTED, Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design, is fundamentally a strategic approach employing a multidisciplinary method aimed at preventing crime through the use of urban and architectural design, as well as also the management of built-in natural elements. And this is aimed at reducing opportunities for crime, hence reducing victimization, as well as also deterring potential offenders by reducing potential opportunities, or at least reducing their confidence that they can commit a crime undetected. And then at the same time, also engendering a sense of community confidence and developing amongst inhabitants within that community a sense of territorial control of their areas, reducing crime, and also minimizing fear of crime in the process. Now, there's a variety of different kinds of strategies that we may be employing in CPTED design. However, most of them kind of fall within four categories, four key principles, as it were. The first being natural surveillance, which entails a variety of strategies aimed at facilitating the ability of people within that environment to witness potential criminal activity. That includes things like making sure that we have unobstructed sight lines throughout our facilities or our properties so people can clearly see potential offenders, minimizing opportunities for offender concealment in the process. And that's done through both the design of our structures, various different landscaping elements, as well as also lighting and illumination. Then we have natural access control. and that is the use of design measures in order to channel entrance into designated points into that particular property to improve our ability in order to recognize potential offenders, as well as also limit potential opportunities for surreptitious entry into our properties for the purpose of committing crimes. Then territorial reinforcement, reinforcing the sense of identity within that property, defining it from the exterior public space to minimize potential trespass into the property, and heighten or to bolster the sense of community ownership. And then we also have maintenance, which is basically the upkeep of the property to both project well, first of all, to ensure that these other different elements that we're implementing are being done correctly and sustainably, but then also at the same time to ensure that the environment is projecting an appearance of order. One of the things that we want to be very conscious of in our CPTED design is the sense of physical disorder, which communicates to potential criminals that this is an environment that they can operate in with impunity. And we'll take a look at how these various different principles specifically relate now to multifamily properties. Now, one of the most basic principles with regards to natural surveillance is ensuring this issue of, as I noted, unobstructed sightlines. And for that purpose, when it comes to vegetation on multifamily residential properties, there's a couple of rules that could be observed. IES, the Illuminating Engineering Society, has a thing called the 3-foot, 7-foot rule. Florida, which is where most of our practitioners are based out of, their guidelines recommend a 2-foot, 6-foot rule, whereby all shrubbery, ground shrubbery, should be no taller than 24 inches or under the IES guideline, 36 inches in height, and that all tree canopies should be no lower than 6 feet in height or under the IES guideline, 7 feet in height. And that's just to ensure that people can see clearly and to minimize potential opportunities for concealment. And in multifamily properties, based on our experience, this is probably one of the more common areas where we run into a lot of problems. And this is an example of what I mean by problematic landscaping conditions here, where we have hedges on the right-hand side and we have other shrubbery on the left-hand side that are obstructing windows, obstructing sightlines as people maneuver or walk along these walkways, as well as also providing potential opportunities for offender concealment. And here's a couple of other examples also illustrating this concern specifically related to offender concealment. On the left, we have a tall row of hedges that is providing a very good concealment opportunity near 2 outdoor restrooms. And on the right-hand side, we have tall shrubbery near the entrance into a property from the exterior public space. So basically, pedestrians entering into the property walk along the sidewalk, and they can't see what's going on around the corner from that sign and that shrubbery. And here's a few other examples also located near entry sidewalks into properties. On the left-hand side, in fact, that shrubbery was roughly about 50 inches in height, pretty tall. You could almost stand on the other side and nobody could see you as you were entering into the property. This is what we typically like to see when we talk about landscaping and CPTED principles. Again, kind of honoring that 2-foot, 6-foot rule I mentioned a minute ago. We also have unobstructed windows facilitating natural surveillance out of the windows, and there's no areas visible here where an offender could potentially benefit from concealment. Here's a couple of other really good examples as well. Even though some of the shrubbery on the left-hand side exceeds 24 inches, still it's low enough that it's not providing anybody with an opportunity for concealment, and it's facilitating clear sight as individuals or pedestrians are navigating the walkway. Now, this issue of offender concealment extends beyond just shrubbery, also to the issue of the way structures are designed. One of the things we ideally would like to do, especially if we're building a new property and we're providing design guidance for new development, is try to minimize areas that structurally provide opportunities for concealment, especially near walkways, building entrances, and parking areas. And this is a really good example right here, where we have these gaps between these parking structures and a wall on the left-hand side, or between 2 structures on the right-hand image, that, considering their location near parking areas or areas where people are going to be moving their vehicles inside of garages, are also completely unilluminated, and at nighttime would be measuring at extraordinarily low illumination levels. Here's a couple of other examples of offender concealment opportunities. Quite frequently, we find in a lot of properties the use of things like aesthetically attractive walls like you see on the left, or In some cases, shrubbery, or maybe even on the right-hand side, we have wooden fencing that is being used to conceal utility equipment, things like air conditioners, or on the right-hand side, a chiller unit for a larger apartment building. And these, again, in these circumstances, often provide a concealment opportunity. And now, with regards to solving these problems, with regard to shrubbery, it's quite often going to be an issue of either trimming it to an appropriate height, if the species will permit, or possibly replacing it with the species that can be maintained effectively at 24 to 36 inches. However, if we have structural elements like these that have already been built, then one way to remedy that is with the selective use of safety mirrors, convex mirrors that basically allow pedestrians approaching these areas to see what's going on behind them. Another approach is also making sure that these areas are very well illuminated to also discourage potential offenders from trying to take benefit from them as a concealment location. And here's an example of a breezeway where the original designers did not really take this into consideration. In fact, this is probably one of the worst examples I think I've seen out of well over 100 multifamily properties that I've assessed. In this case, we have the entrance to a breezeway, but it's designed with almost a completely enclosed vertical wall. So that you're seeing it in the left-hand image from the front as you approach the breezeway. And the center image is as you get closer to the entrance of that breezeway. And then the right image is what it looks like from the inside, if you were standing in the center hallway. In this case, you're entering into a completely blind area where you can't see anything around any of the corners. That creates a bunch of problems. Number one is obviously the concealment thing. But the second part of this also is it obstructs light. So the inside of the breezeway isn't benefiting from any of the outdoor lighting, and conversely, the entrance to the breezeway isn't benefiting from the light inside of the breezeway. Now, again, this is a constructed property. At this point, it would be impractical to try to tear these walls down. So in that case, I believe the recommendation I made in this instance was the use of mirrors in order to facilitate the observation of anybody that might be hidden behind these walls as people are entering into the breezeway. And also making sure that we had good lighting inside of these breezeways so that it would just help discourage anyone from trying to take advantage of the opportunity. Now, on the subject of lighting, the Illuminating Engineering Society actually has guidelines for illuminating multifamily properties in what they call situations where security is a concern, which in Florida, at least, under our best practice guidelines, it would be applied in any facility or any property where crime prevention is the major objective. And in that instance, parking lots should ideally be illuminated at a level of 3.0 foot candles or greater with the maximum contrast ratio of 4:1. Now, that level, actually, the recommended guideline goes up for enclosed parking garages at 6.0, as well as also for outdoor parking lots for seniors at 6.0 and 12.0 for parking garages for seniors. And then for sidewalks in your parking lots, 5.0 for senior living. Sidewalks in general, 1.0. And then any common areas, any kind of outdoor assembly areas like picnic areas and places like this, entrances and breezeways to common area entrances and breezeways, 3.0 foot candles, also with a maximum contrast ratio of 4:1. For mailboxes, because of the fact that people are gathering at the mailbox area and it provides a very predictable location for ambushing people, IES actually has a higher recommendation here at 10 foot candles. They also have a guideline for residential entryways for recognition of people standing at a doorway through peepholes, and that's at 0.8 foot candles at 5 foot vertical. And ACES International also has an additional guideline, but specifically related to CCTV, and that is at least 2.0 or better to ensure that on CCTV we can effectively recognize or describe potential subjects. Now, on the next series of slides, I have some examples of some of the common real-world problems that we run into out there as it relates to lighting. One of the most common is obstructed lights. It is a very common situation whereby when new properties are designed, the lighting designers are not synchronized, we'll say, with the landscape architects that are actually deciding where trees are going to go and other types of tall hedges. And when we look at these photometric plans, often in the initial design phase, they may not look bad. We may see the kind of illumination levels we're looking for, but without accounting for the fact that we may have a tree planted immediately next to a light pole, that when it reaches maturity in 2-3 years or whatever, now suddenly the situation changes. You can see that evident in the image on the left. On the right-hand side, you can see that, and I illustrated that also with illumination measurements along that sidewalk. You can see on the right-hand side, we got illumination levels like 2.1, 2.5, which complies with our expectation. We're looking for 1.0 or greater. But once we get over, further to the left there, where that tree is obstructing it, now we're at 0.0 foot candles. And not only does this result in areas that are dark, but because we have areas that are bright and then we have other areas that are shadowed, it also results in a very high contrast ratio, which makes it difficult for people navigating the environment to recognize somebody hidden inside of that shaded area. And here's a couple more examples. Another one on the left-hand side of obstructed lights by a large overgrown tree. And on the right-hand side, we have a different kind of problem here. This was kind of a weird one. In this instance, they installed these lights, these wall packs, but they mounted them directly above this covered walkway in front of the entrances. So it effectively obstructed it. All they were doing basically was lighting up the roof. And there was no illumination benefit on the actual sidewalks out in front of it. I never found out exactly what the story was in that case, but my suspicion is that initially the covered walkways were not accounted for by the lighting designers when they were designing this. And when their initial photometric, I'll bet if we were to look at it, probably would have just shown a sidewalk with illumination levels of 1.4, 2.0, and other stuff like this, not realizing that that was going to be obstructed. Another problem is inadequate luminous flux. And luminous flux is just a fancy term, technical term for light output, the amount of illumination that's being output by the luminaire. In this case, we don't have any obstruction problems at all. We've got nice, clean, bare lights, unobstructed lights, but they're not giving off enough illumination. In the left-hand side, 0.2 to 0.3. In all those areas, that those measurements were taken. On the right-hand side, 0.1 to 0.5, which is below the 1.0 we're typically looking for on sidewalks. Here's another example on the left of a wall pack that's only putting out uniformly around 0.2 foot candles near the sidewalk below. And on the right-hand side, an example of a building entranceway measured at 0.2 to 0.8. Typically with common area entrances, we're looking for 3.0 or better. And in this case, the problem isn't inoperative lights or, again, obstruction. It's just simply that the lights just don't put out enough light. The luminous flux, in other words, is insufficient. And here's an example on the left of a breezeway, again, under-illuminated. I should be seeing meter readings here of 3.0 or better, at least on average. And on the right-hand side is an example of mailboxes that are also under-illuminated. The problem in this case is inoperative lights. It's just simply the fact that the lights aren't putting out enough light. Some cases, that's the result of bulb degradation. As a consultant, when I'm out there doing these assessments, I can often tell that when I go between buildings and I see some buildings with the same lighting that have acceptable lighting illumination levels, and then we have other buildings that are not. In that instance, it's usually the fact that we have aged bulbs that are just not putting out enough light anymore. They need to be replaced. In other cases, if we see this problem uniformly throughout an entire property, then that's usually an indicator that the lights just don't have sufficient luminous flux. Another problem is absent lights, especially in areas where people congregate outdoors or community spaces like playgrounds. Tend to see this kind of problem also areas like pavilions that have no lights as well, that people congregate outdoors, outdoor smoking areas in some cases. Degraded and inoperative lights is another problem again, too. A moment ago, I mentioned about bulb degradation. When they get to the point where they're just glowing at, a certain level and they're barely providing any illumination in the area at all. And that's kind of what the problem is that you see on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, the entire building was out. This, mind you, wasn't just a security concern. This was a safety concern. In fact, residents inside of that building on the right had to navigate their way to their front doors utilizing a flashlight on their phone. This was a major potential liability concern if somebody was to become injured or something like this. And that was an issue. And by the way, in that particular instance right there, nobody could clearly explain to me how long the electricity had been out in that building. But it's my understanding from talking to a few residents, it had been at least a couple of weeks. Another issue that we also look for when we're talking about lighting and design or when assessing and improving properties is glare. And this is often a problem on a lot of properties where maintenance personnel have taken it upon themselves to install lights to improve illumination, often in areas where it was insufficient before, but without recognizing or failing to account for the fact that lights mounted very low, especially very bright lights mounted very low, are going to create a new kind of problem, which is actually interfering with the ability of people in order to see darkened areas behind them or around those lights. And you can see that evident on the left-hand side where we have a floodlight that was mounted low on a building to illuminate some parking spaces that were too dark before. We have that with these wall packs on the right-hand side. That when they designed this property, they installed the wall packs very, very low and without cutoff fixtures. And as a result, when you approach these entrances to these breezeways, you're basically blinded almost by the light. In fact, the photograph here kind of actually improves the appearance. In reality, when I was out there taking that image, it was much more dramatic, in terms of the glare effect. Here's a couple of other examples, again, of low-mounted floodlights, installed by well-intentioned maintenance personnel, recognizing that the area around these stairs on the right and then this walkway on the left was under-illuminated, so they installed it, but they installed them too low and without any kind of cutoff fixture. And as a result, you're just shining light directly into the eyes of people as they're navigating along the walkway. And this is probably one of the worst examples I've ever seen on this on a property. And this was bare fluorescent light bulbs without even a diffuser cover installed on the inside, facing directly at the car as it's parking or people that are approaching the parking area. And as a result, the entire area behind where these carport structures are is just completely black. You can't see anything standing on the other side as a result of the extreme levels of glare. And that relates to another problem in many cases, which is high contrast ratio. And contrast ratio just basically describes the variance between the lighter areas and the darker areas within a given scene. And that's a common problem where we often have lights installed that produce glare. We also find it in other situations too. Another common one is where we have extensive use of path lighting that's employed, but without other lighting, ambient lighting up the surrounding area. So in this case, the actual pathway was pretty well illuminated. You can navigate this safely. But because the pathway is very brightly lit, it tends to exaggerate perception of darkness in the surrounding area, thus making it much easier for somebody to take concealment or something and benefit from that, from the darkness. And then quite often we run into a lot of situations where it's a combination of factors. And these are two examples right here involving mailboxes, where we have inoperative lights as well as also obstructions and absent lights. On the left-hand side, we actually have a light mounted on the side of that mailbox structure, but it's presently inoperative. And then there's near that a pole light, which you can see the illumination coming from on the left-hand side of the image. But because of the design of the structure, ends up creating a strong, significant shadow on the right-hand side, making it relatively easy for an offender to take concealment in that area. On the right-hand side, we have also an example of a mailbox structure with sidewalls that obstruct the light from the nearby light poles. And because they don't have any lights inside of the mailbox structure, also ends up kind of contributing to this problem. Again, substandard illumination levels of 0.0 to 0.3 measured in that instance. And here's another example, kind of a combination of problems. In this case, inadequate luminous flux, obstructions, in this case, obstructions from these columns that are blocking other nearby lights, resulting in a lot of shadowed areas, and then also absent light at the entry into the breezeways. And in these cases, measuring everywhere from 0.0 to around 3.3 in the left-hand side in the hallway, which is adequate. That's kind of what we're looking for. But the stairwell and the entrances into the breezeways are very dark. Now, in both of these examples right here, by the way, these are both from the same property. And when I was out on this property, I was also training some new team members, younger members of our team. And I asked them what they felt and what they thought as they were approaching these buildings. And it gave them a feeling of fear because there's just these super dark areas, that are just completely shadowed, obstructed sight lines, and then you got this, this illumination problem in the process too. And that is exactly what our residents are probably feeling every time that they approach their breezeways as well, in this property at least. Now, this is what we like to see in these kinds of situations. This is two examples of well-illuminated breezeways. And in fact, the contrast ratio is actually excellent in both these examples. You see on the left-hand side, we have illumination levels ranging from 3.4 all the way up to 16. 31.8 on the stairs itself, but all well within the tolerance that we're looking for, 4-to-1 contrast ratio. And on the right-hand side, same thing. Also, very good light uniformity, as it were, and all areas illuminated above specification or above guidelines. Here's an excellent example of a well-illuminated entrance into a building. Illumination level ranging from 5.3 to 8.7. Again, also excellent light uniformity. And another point I didn't bring up a moment ago, too, was also about the color temperature or the color rendering. We ideally want to employ light that has a high CRI or is high on the CRI index, color rendering index. And that basically compares the different temperature of the light to natural daylight. Natural daylight is a CRI of 100, and then typically find that with LED. That would be natural, the same equivalent as natural sunlight. Some lighting systems like LED tend to produce light that has this excellent color rendering, which means that it's going to make it a little bit easier for witnesses to recognize appropriately the color of clothing, color of automobiles, that kind of thing, as well as also when we're looking at CCTV footage later, in order to accurately recognize what the color of a car was, maybe that was seen engaged in suspicious activity in a parking lot. And in both those examples, those breezeways a moment ago, as well as here, we see excellent color rendition. Here we have a dumpster trash compactor on the left-hand side, also very well illuminated, also good light uniformity. And on the right-hand side, very well illuminated pavilion area, 21 to 25.9, doing it with those measurements. That also is excellent light uniformity. And here we have two textbook, well-lit mailbox areas. Again, high illumination or high levels of illumination, and also excellent light uniformity. Now, in addition to lighting and making sure that we have landscaping that minimizes obstruction of sight lines and building structures that don't provide concealment opportunities, another aspect of CPTED is designing opportunities that are going to facilitate potential natural surveillance, potential opportunities by people in the environment in order to see something suspicious. And in multifamily properties, that often will relate to where we locate different kinds of community spaces. And here's two examples where we have outdoor sitting areas, eating areas or whatnot, picnic areas, but they were well located right next to parking lots that allows people that are congregating at these areas to recognize any kind of suspicious activity in the parking areas. One of the things that I find once in a while that I'm not a big fan of is when you have these larger properties that are designed, but they take all the community spaces and they centrally locate them behind buildings where they end up providing very little natural surveillance benefit as it relates to sidewalks and parking areas. But these are two good examples of where they are well positioned. Here's two examples also of outdoor sitting areas. One is actually a patio that's located on the second level of a multi-story apartment building, and it provides a good view of the area where parking is located below. And then on the right-hand side is an example of an outdoor sitting area inside of that. Actually, it's in the same building, actually at ground level, located near the doors entering into the building, which provides smokers and other people like this an opportunity to sit outdoors, but also facilitating natural surveillance of the inside of the parking garage, as well as also the sidewalk entrances that are approaching that parking garage. Now, we also in CPTED can employ different types of design elements in order to reinforce territoriality. And that includes the use of things like landscaping elements and walls and other similar types of materials and structures in order to define the private space from the exterior public space. And that doesn't necessarily have to be anything overly sophisticated. Here's a very simple example of it, where simply a row of hedging is being employed in order to define the inside of this property boundary from the exterior sidewalk area. Another concept in CPTED is the use of a celebrated entryway in order to aid with establishing territoriality, but also at the same time in order to reinforce the appearance of the property and thus improve its appearance, and also at the same time project an image to potential offenders that this is an organized environment. where crime will not be tolerated or there's a lower probability that they'll be able to succeed in committing crime. Now, related to this matter is also the use of restrictive and warning signage. Most of us are familiar with, no trespassing signage and things of that nature. Well, this all one serves as a legal warning in many states for potential a criminal trespass, but also notifies potential criminals that crime will not be tolerated on this property and that we are attentive or at least cognizant enough that we're going to go ahead and we're going to post notices restricting or warning of this fact. Now, one thing to be aware of when employing restrictive signage or warning signage is be conscious of the language, that it doesn't contribute to a false expectation of security. And this is actually a liability matter. This is an example of a sign that I would recommend that this particular property remove and replace with another sign. And it's simply because of the way it's worded. This property, instead of saying this property is monitored by surveillance cameras or surveillance cameras are present, that kind of thing, it says this property is quote unquote protected by surveillance cameras. And that creates a false expectation of security. Surveillance cameras don't protect against anything. And one of the other problems that I observed on this particular location where this sign was posted was they had these signs located in many areas where there weren't even surveillance cameras. And that also potentially creates a future liability problem as well, too. This is what I prefer to see, these kinds of signs. The one on the left-hand sign is actually written from a legal perspective very well and basically explains the limitations of the cameras and specifically what their purpose is. And then on the right-hand side, that's just, kind of a simple, friendly community, kind of sign, just alerting that cameras are present, but doesn't state, that this is protected by or anything like that. And it's well located too. It's located right next to a playground. So it kind of has that kind of, that smiley face and that kind of a playful type of feeling to it. Now, wayfinding signage, if we have a property that is relatively complex in its layout or we have many buildings, it is desirable to make sure that we have good wayfinding signage so that people can easily find their location on property. And here's two good examples. One, we got a property map located along an entrance drive into a property, and on the left, building signage that can be easily seen from drive paths as well as sidewalks. And that's mainly to ensure that we don't have a whole lot of lost people, potentially, creating a potential misrecognition of potential suspicious activity on property, as well as also for emergency responders and people like this that may be coming out on site. Now, another related principle to territoriality and kind of touches on a couple of the other principles I described a moment ago is the use of transition zones, which are basically designed areas, usually at the point of passage, like a sidewalk or a vehicle entry drive, that aids in defining the territorial boundary of the property, often in a manner that also reinforces the appearance of the property too. It kind of overlaps with that principle of celebrated entryways. And here's a great example of where brick pavers and attractive architectural elements are being used as a transition zone at the entry into these two different properties. Now, one thing that is an issue that comes up quite frequently when we talk about CPTED is the issue of maintenance. We want to ensure that the properties that that we are working with are projecting an image of organization, or what might be called symmetry. And that again, that that an ordered environment is less attractive to potential criminal actors. Criminal actors are more likely to operate inside of an environment that appears to be physically disordered. For those that are familiar with criminology concepts, this goes all the way back to the broken windows theory. And here's some examples of the kinds of stuff that does frequently pop up in multifamily properties. Things like, and again, breezeway signage, like the exit sign that you see that's dangling by wire on the left-hand side. I probably have about 30 images like this from CPTED assessments in the past. On the right-hand side, you got an example of a screen that's laying on the ground. How long it's been laying there, I don't know. Probably a long time from how it looked when I examined it. Damaged fencing on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have an example of paint that is all kind of scuffed up over time. That even though, these aren't considered to be directly crime prevention related matters, the visual appearance contributes to the image or the appearance of disorder. Here we have damaged and faded signage, again, kind of projecting that image that we don't really care here. ground litter and uncollected trash. Now, when we run into a situation where this is just kind of isolated around a few buildings, that's often an issue that can be corrected easily just by addressing the residents that reside inside of that building, cleaning it up, setting community standards, giving everybody a nice warning, and then monitoring it very closely, and then dealing with any kind of problematic residents that are contributing to it. But sometimes we run into these situations where ground litter and uncollected trash have become almost kind of like a cultural fixture, where residents are literally just carrying garbage bags out and dumping them on the side of the street or on the side of the parking lot. Once a community has reached that point, correcting this kind of problem can get pretty difficult, and requires a much more active type approach. But this definitely contributes to the appearance of disorder or social disorder within a community. Now, at the very beginning of this presentation, it was mentioned that there is a new statute in Florida. I realize that many people watching this are not located in Florida, but for those who are, or for those who want to kind of keep their thumb on the pulse of what's going in other parts of the country. Back in 2022, we passed a new law here in Florida that is Statute 7680706, which provides a presumption against liability to owners and operators or management companies managing multifamily properties by as a result of any kind of crime committed by third parties, granted that they meet certain kind of conditions. And the way they wrote the statute, it's actually broken down into 3 separate paragraphs. Paragraph 1 requires that the property complies with 7 physical property conditions. They're basically physical security related conditions. Things like having camera coverage on all points of entry and exit, as well as footage that's retrievable for 30 days. There's certain matters related to lighting, like having an average illumination level of 1.8 foot candles at 18 inches in the parking lot, lighting in all common areas and entrances, as well as also laundry rooms, as specifically stated in the statute. And then there's also a number of things related to unit security, like having 1-inch deadbolt throws, peepholes on doors, and locking devices on windows, and other elements like this. Then the second paragraph requires that there's a crime prevention through environmental design assessment performed within the previous 3 years by either a law enforcement agency or a Florida CPTED practitioner, which is a designation that many consultants like my team have obtained in the state of Florida. And then they must be substantially compliant with that assessment. So not only have the assessment done, but then they must be substantially, quote unquote, compliant with it. And then part number 3 is that they must provide, quote unquote, proper crime deterrence and safety training to all current employees, as well as all new employees within 60 days of hire. And that needs to be maintained in a sustainable manner. And then if an organization meets these 3 conditions, they have a presumption against liability. Very powerful protection. And to date, the only state in the United States that has currently provided this substantial of an opportunity in order for mitigating potential crime-related risk. However, there is discussion going on that I'm aware of in a couple of other states about adopting, similar legislation. And hopefully we begin seeing this kind of concept or this kind of legal approach being adopted in more and more states, providing those of you maybe outside of Florida with a similar opportunity to mitigate your risk. And that pretty much concludes my presentation. So I think at this point, we'll pass this over to Leon and the team at West Palm Beach Housing Authority.
Wait, let me. All right. So thank you, Craig. So me and Michael McManaman, I'm the Director of Risk Control Program Compliance for the West Palm Beach Housing Authority. And then Michael is the Director of our Contract Insurance Compliance. I'm going to discuss how we implemented CPTED into the redevelopment of Dunbar Village. And then Mike's going to talk a little bit about the insurance implications with Florida State Statute 7680706. Why do I mention, starting out my presentation, our former Executive Director, Laurel Robinson, and our current Executive Director, Linda Odom? You need buy-in from the top to really get CPTED moving in your organization. When your asset managers, your asset directors are kind of giving you that pushback. Oh, we don't need to trim our shrubbery down to 2 feet, 3 feet. You need that person at the top that has that buy-in to really say, nope, let's go ahead, let's get the quotes for our landscaping and let's push it through. So in 2016, I received my FCP designation, which is a Florida CPTED practitioner. So Florida is the only state in the US to where you can receive a designation from an actual government entity. The FCP is designated from the Florida Attorney General's office. And why not try to reduce crime through the design of the environment? It just makes sense. And my PowerPoint stopped. It just makes sense. It's a cost-effective way to try and reduce crime. Ultimately, what's the goal of CPTED? We're shooting to alter human behavior through the design of environment. Everybody in here on this call, I'm sure, is familiar with the Housing Act of 1937. Why am I mentioning these dates? So the Housing Act of 1937 was enacted. 1940, we start to see our initial public housing projects go up. For example, in 1940, Dunbar Village construction was completed. CPTED doesn't really come around to the 1960s. Methodology used in CPTED was influenced by journalist Jane Jacobs and her writings in the 1960s. Then in the 1970s, CPTED started to emerge through the work of criminologist C. Ray Jeffries and architect Oscar Newman. In 2008, Dunbar Village was approved for demolition. So CPTED comes along, 1960s, 1970s. Dunbar Village is developed and built in 1940s. I doubt the planners and the development team was looking at the site plans and the construction plans with security and crime prevention in mind. So we have this housing development in 2008 that pretty much for the most part went unchanged in its whole phase. We'll dive a little bit more into site plans in a few minutes. And this presentation, I'm pretty much giving the Cliff Notes version. This is about an hour, hour and a half presentation that we do. But talking to some aspects of actual CPTED. So this is an aerial image of a playground on one of our properties. So when we talk about human behavior is affected by colors. So when we talk about Dunbar Village and the redevelopment, Dunbar Village sat on a 17-acre parcel of land. On that 17-acre parcel of land, we now have 4 developments. This is one of the 4 developments on that land. We're looking at an aerial of the playground. If you look at the colors of the playground, you have blue should be considered, blue is considered a common color. You would be hard pressed to find any aggressive colors on this playground, red or color in that spectrum. And then during the design phase, when I looked at the plans, I noticed there was only one park bench for this playground. So one thing with CPTED, it's all you're trying to place people in the area to create natural surveillance. So by only one bench, you're kind of limiting where people can sit. So I recommended adding a few benches, and you put those benches in a way to where you're almost creating an invisible barrier to where the adults or children sitting on the benches kind of create that invisible fence to where you can see people coming in and out of the area and creating that 360-degree area of surveillance. And then they decided during the last moment to add a fence around it. So not only do we have the coverage with the park benches, we also have a fence. Talking territorial reinforcement, transition zones. I know Craig touched base on it. So throughout the Dunbar property or the current property where Dunbar used to sit, we have public streets. So let me see if I can get my pointer. There we go. So this street running between, to the south, we have Royal Palm Place. To the north, we have Silver Palm Place. This is a public street. And you can see when you make that right-hand turn and that left-hand turn into the property. Now the driveway to the left, to the bottom of the screen, is the same style with pavers. So you make that right-hand turn into the property, you start to transition from asphalt to a semi-private transition zone. You have pavers. It's giving the individual coming into the property a sense that something's changing. I just went from asphalt, now I'm moving into brick pavers. It's nicer. There's more of a sense of ownership and that people care for the property. And then once you exit those pavers, it's extremely obvious you're on a residential private property. You can see at the top of the screen, we have a roundabout, you have a pool to the left, and then apartments in the parking lot. So it's a clear transition from public, semi-private to private property, reinforcing the ownership of the property and the territory. So you heard a lot from Craig and Hector about lighting. Why? Lighting is one of the most cost-effective crime prevention tools. Lighting improves security by creating the ability to observe human activity. Quality of lighting, and Craig touched base on it a little bit, quality of lighting, type of lighting can affect the appearance of colors. We're not going to go down the rabbit hole, but like Craig said, there should be somebody on staff that has the knowledge to know what the CRI, what the Kelvin of the lights on your property should be. And when upgrading our lights and putting new lights in, we should always have a white light source. With LED technology, there's no reason why it's so affordable not to have LED on our property. But a white light source can come from, of course, LED or metal halide. So let's talk about photometric plans and site plans. So while this is a new project we are currently working on, 1400 Henrietta in West Palm Beach. So somebody like Craig was mentioning too, site plans, looking where the light poles are, knowing how to read the photometric plan. Someone on staff should be able to look at a set of site plans and tell you what they see from a security standpoint, from a CPTED standpoint. There should be somebody on staff with some level of training. As Craig alluded to earlier, those IES standards, you can see this project. If you look at our parking and driveway, we're at 3.44 and IES calls for 3.0. I would be lying if I said this was the light readings on the first version of the plans. No matter what the project is, we always have to come back and recommend increasing the lighting. It is getting better the more projects we do with developers. CPTED's definitely catching on and becoming more prevalent, but there has not been a project I've done with the housing authority where we haven't had to recommend increased lighting. So to the north of this property, while the parking lot lighting was great, when we got the photometric plans, we have this walkway around a field. It's going to be a dry retention pond and then a proposed clubhouse. So we have this walkway with no photometric readings. And our goal is to be compliant with the Florida State Statute 768. It gives us a level of protection. And what's one of the first things we see when we get sued as housing authorities? Inadequate security, lack of physical security, lack of lighting. So we want that level of protection on all our properties moving forward. So this was a recommendation that we needed to have levels and light readings along this pathway. And then we also needed to light up the dry retention area. And since this was developed, we just got a set of plans that implemented the light on the pathways to adequate levels and adding in security lighting to the dry retention area. Landscaping, somebody should be able to look at the landscaping plans, and like Craig said, are the lights and the trees interacting with each other? What type of trees are we putting on the property? Is it going to interfere and go against CPTED principles? So we have this little battle going. I wouldn't say battle. This is an issue that I've mentioned. We go back. So this is the perimeter of the property. So we have shrubbery that is going to be hedges that's going to be 6 feet tall along the main front side of the property. While West Palm Beach is a CPTED city, this property lies in an overlay area that calls for 6-foot hedges along the front of the property. I am looking forward to the meeting with the city planners and the development team to ask them why, if we're a CPTED city, do we have overlays going against CPTED principles? I mean, 2 foot, we can argue about 2 foot, 3 foot, even 4 foot, but 6 foot, creating hiding areas, you're getting into areas for people to hide, you're getting into light shadowing. There's so many issues with tall shrubs, especially along the front of the property, that can promote criminal activity. So when I recommended we remove the shrubs, our in-house development team, Mike, was one of them. He goes, yeah, we can't do that. That's, I'm like, why can't we do that? And that was kind of a rabbit hole for us to go down. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the crime stats, kind of see CPTED, real life. Can you contribute these stat comparisons directly to crime prevention through environmental design? I would say some of it, yes. All of it, we have a lot of measures on the property, but where Dunbar Village used to be in 2007, we had 246 units. Today, on that same parcel of land, we have 353 units. You can see in 2007, with approximately 100 less units, serious crime was 29, robberies were 4, and burglaries were 3. And currently, in 2024, the first 5.5 months, I did the first 5.5 months of each year. So in 2024, serious crime was 1, robberies were 1, burglaries were 0, and there was such a large number of redacted cases, I did include that. But when you're looking at redacted cases, those are mostly incidents dealing with minors, DCF calls, other type of issues involving minors. Can you contribute the change in serious crime directly to CPTED? Like I said, there's a lot of measures. We have on that 17-acre parcel of land, we have 130 cameras throughout the 4 different properties. But the lighting is tremendous. The lighting is well above IES standards, and lighting does bring a sense of security, and it promotes CPTED principles, especially natural surveillance. So you can kind of see, here's some previous images. These images were taken sometime in 1943 to 1945, and this is the old Dunbar Village. And what you see here is pretty much what you saw in 2007 up into the demolition time. No major changes in site design. This is sometime in the early 2000s, Dunbar Village. Again, more Dunbar Village. And you can see not a big change from when it was built to the early 2000s. Another picture, this is when we started demolition and building. I believe this was phase 1. And then, so right here, this is the 17-acre parcel of land. So to the south, we have Royal Palm Place. In the center, we have Silver Palm Place. To the north, we have Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And then to the west, we have 8 units of traditional low-income public housing. So on that 17-acre parcel of land, we now have 4 different properties, and you can see we went vertical with all the projects except for the public housing to the top of the screen. This is Silver Palm Place. This is the pool and playground area. And then right behind in this area, you have a full gym for the residents attached to the leasing office. This is another aerial view. So this is Silver Palm Place still. And then to the north, you have Paul Lawrence Dunbar. You look at the design, lots of windows, soft colors, landscaping, tons and tons of light poles. You see the territorial reinforcement with the pavers. Landscaping that you can see through. Yes, we have to trim this down at times, but for the most part, we don't have any, there's no landscaping that's going to obstruct sight lines. And it just, this project, to the credit of our former executive director, Laurel Robinson, Linda Odom, I believe Michael McManaman was on this development team, Lisa Maxwell, Charlotte Burnett. There was truly a buy-in to design this property to promote positive activity and to deter crime. So I just gave you a Cliff Note version of the presentation. It just so happens today's presentation coincides with the full presentation. I'm doing a webinar for the U.S. CPTED Association this Thursday, July 17th, from 12 to 1, where we are going to do the full presentation on the redevelopment of Dunbar Village and really dive into some more detailed aspects of the project. Mike, I'm going to hand off to you in a second.
Okay.
Some great organizations, Florida Design Out Crime Association, FLDOCA. Don't have to be in Florida to join. It just gives you great access to training and different individuals that are active in the community, from law enforcement, designers, architects. Then, of course, you have the U.S. CPTED Association, which is the U.S., I would say the U.S. version of Florida Design Out Crime. And then you have the National Institute of Crime Prevention, where you can receive CPTED training, the Florida Crime Prevention Training Institute, where you can get your FCP designation, Florida CPTED practitioner. That's through the Florida Attorney General's office, and of course, critical intervention services.
Craig and
Mr.
Hector, did you guys have anything else that you wanted to add before we go into some questions?
Yeah, I definitely do. Michael made a great point when it comes to the standard of care. And I will say that when we try to help our clients, they would say, how do we protect ourselves? How do we protect our community from crime and protect ourselves from litigation? And we are seeing that CPTED is becoming the standard of care and arguably is the standard of care. And so I will tell clients that if you want a level of defensibility, CPTED is a great place to start. It's an international methodology that is applied around the world. Many states recognize it. Almost every single law, I do not know of a law enforcement agency that does not accept or recognize CPTED standards. And so that is a great place to start, because if you are in compliance with CPTED methodology, then it gives you the ability to have some type of defensibility. And I would definitely start there. The other thing, I'm going to start with the lighting. There was a question about lighting and how lighting should be conducted. I want Craig to start on that, but then I also have some information I want to add on to that.
Sure. Well, I mean, the quick answer to that question is measurement with a light meter. IES actually has guidelines for how to take lighting illumination measurements. Typically, that would be at ground level or in some cases also at 5 foot vertical. And there's many different manufacturers for light meters out there. The ones that we use our internally, our organization, are made by FLIR, which is one of the better manufacturers of light meters. We also get ours calibrated. NIST calibrated. And the primary reason why is because there's a high probability that the work product that we generate could get challenged in court at some point. So we want to make sure that everything we're doing in terms of our T's crossed and I's dotted to try to leave a plaintiff attorney at a dead end if they try finding an approach to discrediting any of the work that we've done. But if you're just doing it internally and all you're doing is just to figure out where you're at and you don't expect that the work product you're generating with your measurements is going to be potentially subject to litigation or scrutiny in court, then any light meter will probably serve you well. Even if it's maybe off by 0.1, 0.2 foot candles or something, still, knowing that we got 3.2 is pretty good. That gives me an idea, as to where we're standing illumination wise. But I strongly recommend, in addition to the CPTED training that Leon just explored, also take a look at the IES guidelines themselves, because they will kind of be a guide to what your expected illumination levels should be in these different locations.
The other thing I want to add to lighting is that sometimes we'll have clients that they will hire a security consultant or a lighting company to come out there and conduct a lighting assessment. And then they will determine to say, hey, listen, we're going to go ahead and commit to these lighting upgrades. And sometimes these upgrades can cost anywhere between $20,000 to $150,000. And so they will do this work ultimately for a neighboring community. Usually a single family community will contact code enforcement and make a complaint that the light is too bright. And you'll have code enforcement showing up, comparing your photometric plan that was approved on construction or the current code, and find you in violation, ultimately to find yourself having to lower these lights or having to turn some of them off, kind of not getting your ROI on the investment for these lighting upgrades. So what I would say is extremely important that after you do these assessments, that you would require the lighting company that you are looking to hire to contact the city and ensure that the plan that is going to be implemented is going to be allowed, and so that you're not wasting money. The other thing is that a lot of times in counties and in cities, they might have a code that would be in conflict to your lighting upgrades, but a lot of times we find that there's concessions, there's waivers, that if these lighting upgrades are connected for crime prevention purposes, such as CPTED standards, that there's a person or a panel that would allow to override that and approve you. If they do not, at least you can have some defensibility where you can have a legal notice sent by your legal team saying that, listen, I want to be able to do this to protect our residents. And they could say, I'm sorry, but you can't do it. And that's going to be Exhibit A in a future litigation where you could say, listen, we spent the money to do this assessment. We were prepared to make this financial investment, and the city or the county told us no. So that is something you want to do. The other thing is we want to transfer risk as much as possible. So if you're looking at meeting the 2 foot, 6 foot rule or the 3 foot, 7 foot rule, as Craig noted earlier, we want to make sure that your landscaping companies, that there's an addendum to the contract that they will maintain those standards. And by doing that, the reality is you can't rely on your maintenance team or your regional directors to go out there and make sure that landscaping is being maintained. Your landscaping company is doing this on a weekly basis. So add that addendum to transfer that risk, that is part of their scope of work. So if that is not maintained and it is part of their scope of work and you have appropriate indemnification language, then we now have the ability to transfer some risk over to a partner. Same thing with cameras. If we want to maintain cameras, which is if you install the camera, you're responsible to maintain it. And so it is a good idea to contract with a local CCTV provider that a lot of times they provide maintenance packages. Well, they'll go out there, they'll clean housing. They'll make sure that the cameras are working properly, that there's proper storage, which is 30 days is a minimum. And that's not just in the state of Florida, really industry wide. You want a minimum of at least 30 days worth of footage retention. But also, a lot of times they can have built-in analytics that if there's a lightning strike or something should happen where the NVR, the camera is no longer functioning, it will provide a report to your camera provider, which in turn will activate a service request. And then again, we are transferring that risk over to a vendor that specializes in this. And so some of the things I would definitely recommend. As far as the CRI that Craig was referring to earlier, the rendering index, when you go to Walmart or you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you buy bulbs, a lot of times you'll see on the side of the package where you'll see something that says like 2000K, 3000K, 4000K, and it'll have, a color from yellow all the way to a really bright blue. That is the measuring of the light temperature. And so for security crime prevention applications, we want to ensure that when you're reviewing that with a contractor, that it's between 4 to 5,000 Kelvin, not above 5,000 Kelvin and not below 4,000 Kelvin. That gives you a white enough light that can assist people that are traversing or driving through the property to be able to identify color. That's why they call it a color rendering index. So if there was victimization or there was a potential suspect or suspicious activity, if I'm walking my dog, because the lighting is between the 4,000 to 5,000 Kelvin, that could provide law enforcement or security with an accurate description, such as I could tell he was wearing black pants and a blue shirt or, a yellow hat. That's when that's kind of an overall explanation of the CRI and how it should be implemented when it comes to lighting.
We had a comment come through that says we have sensor-based parking lot lighting, and based on what they hear, this is not beneficial to their property. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to expand upon on that.
You said that it was not beneficial to their property.
Yes, based on what they heard during the session, it sounds like it's not beneficial for their property.
So actually, if it's motion activated lighting that goes into a low power mode, it's actually very beneficial. So humans are attracted to movement. So if I'm traversing in and out of, like, let's say a parking garage and I'm walking to my vehicle and maybe 5 or 6 cars down, we have lighting that is in a low power mode that goes into a high power mode. That is going to avert my attention over to that lighting being activated and potentially identify an offender that might be trying to commit a crime against me or somebody else. What I caution clients is that those sensors have to be maintained. And so in parking garages, a lot of times we find is that they're not maintained. And so that light goes into a low power mode and never activates into its intention. And so again, maintenance, which is a part of CPTED, has to be implemented in those type of applications.
Yeah, if I may add, another great situation where motion activated lighting works excellent is, like, let's say we have an area behind a building that doesn't have a sidewalk. Installing motion activated lights in these areas can often be very beneficial in that if anybody is skulking around in the dark out there, you know, triggers the light giving at that particular point and alerts other people in the surrounding area. But yet, since we don't need to illuminate those areas at all times, keeps, electricity costs down.
And adding to what you both just said, we actually have a property where we came in as the management company. We had no play in the development. And I remember the first time I drove onto that property at night, I'm like, oh, the parking lot's pitch black. This is a brand new development. And as I'm driving, the lights are popping on. And to what Hector said, we just need to make sure that the sensors continue to work, because it was really interesting driving through the property and seeing the lights pop on as you come into the area. So no, there's definitely a benefit to it, and
Yeah.
I
Just
think
to
we're
add,
perfectly fine.
just to add one more thing onto that, I just assessed a property where these lights have certain function or options to them. In a stairwell in a community, they actually turn off. So there is no low power mode. It just, after a certain amount of inactivity, they turn off. We do not want that. There needs to be a certain level of lighting, especially in stairwells and garages and internal breezeway areas. So never you. Sometimes clients will say, "Well, we could save a bunch of money if it's just turned off." In those type of applications, it's just really not worth it. It should always be illuminated in a low power setting and then activated with motion, but never completely off.
And yes, Becky, it does help with lighting pollution.
Okay, there's another question. Have you ever come across issues or concerns with either natural surveillance or security cameras compromising residents' privacy?
I personally have never seen that before. That is definitely not something within the states that I've assessed as a concern, but I would definitely research that. There are some states that do require you to post signage. In the state of Florida, you do not. There's no expectation of privacy in the common areas, but there are states that if you're a private entity, you are required to at least provide notice that cameras are in use. So I would just check with your local, ordinances and city laws. But other than that, I don't see an issue with that.
And we have never had any issues, to my knowledge, come up with complaints to the amount of security cameras or how we promote natural surveillance on our properties from any residents or managers. If anything, they are welcoming
Yeah.
of the cameras.
Yeah.
And the clear sight lines.
Yeah, I would just add to Craig's point earlier, cameras cannot protect people. So when you as a multifamily owner operator implementing cameras for really the purposes, the main primary goal of those cameras and responsibility is post-incident investigation. So if your property is vandalized, there was a slip and fall, you're using those cameras for to be able to investigate exactly what's going on. If you are looking to utilize cameras as a proactive means to deter crime, um, one of the things you can use is that if they're monitored. So there are camera services out there where they utilize voice over IP, where they would actively monitor the camera. Most of the times it's at specific times of day. They can communicate on the other side of the camera, letting them know that they're trespassing or that law enforcement, is being contacted. If you have on-site security, a lot of times those third-party camera monitoring companies can contact your security team for response or local law enforcement for response. But that's really the only way to be able to implement a a camera system to be uh, proactive versus reactive. So be very careful that you're not implementing cameras for the purposes of trying to quote unquote protect residents.
And then there was just one more question. Are there any new technologies that you've seen that you think will have a big impact on CPTED going forward?
Well, as far as technology, definitely camera technology is coming along tremendously. For instance, we worked with a client where there was a lot of bells and whistles in their camera systems that were just not being utilized. A lot of analytics built into the cameras. For instance, cameras can now be used and a lot of times integrated in your current access control system. So instead of giving proximity cards or codes out to residents, which I really don't like because you give out the code and then everybody has the code by the end of the week, right? But you can program license plates so that if you have an access control gate, that license plate recognition camera will read the tag. It will go in the database and say, oh yeah, that's Hector's car, and allow entry into the property. That technology is being used a lot to be able to identify unauthorized residents. So a lot of times you'll have, a grandson or a boyfriend or somebody that's not living in the property that is becoming a nuisance or involved in crime or illicit activity. And that's really a good way to be able to identify someone who is living on property. The other thing is to be able to use the cameras for people who have been trespassed. So if your security team or law enforcement trespasses somebody, a lot of times you can take a screenshot of that camera and built it into the system. So if that vehicle or that person comes on property, it can notify you, live to your security team or law enforcement. If you have a monitoring service that this person has been trespassed, it can even be linked to the specific event. So that's the way you can utilize cameras, as a proactive means.
Okay. And we did just have a comment come through. It says, HUD does not allow facial recognition technology with cameras if you used grant or HUD money to buy the cameras. This is different than camera analytics. However, it is important for people to know if buying cameras with those funds for public housing properties.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a great note.
And to the analytic part, these systems take out the facial recognition. You can type in male, red shorts, black backpack, and the system will go back and pull out any male with red shorts, a backpack. It just, the analytics and the AI and the software coming along is insane to what can be used on our properties.
The other thing I would just add on is, again, lighting, which is so important. Every management company that I've worked with has some type of policy in place to conduct lighting assessments, whether it's their maintenance team or their security contractor to conduct the lighting assessments, which should be done on a weekly basis. Where I find issues is that those assessments are either not documented or they're documented, but those issues are not rectified in a reasonable amount of time, meaning that there was a work order put in for several, lights that are, maybe there's a bad photo cell, or you have these 4 street lights that are on, that are connected that haven't been functioning for a month, and there was an incident that occurred on property. That lack of documentation, or the documentation that showed that those lights weren't functioning and nobody rectified them, is a huge issue. So you have to have a policy in place to be able to conduct the lighting assessments. And at the same time, you also have to make sure that there's I typically like at least a week. So I like it within the week, but at least a week, or no later, for lighting issues to be rectified. For your maintenance teams, I would also highly recommend that there's a practice where, if there's a dual lamp fixture, maybe there's a fixture with 2 bulbs in that fixture, and one of those light bulbs go out, that you just replace both of them. Sometimes they'll just replace one, but if one went out, the other bulb is probably at the end of the life cycle, so it's a good practice just to switch them out at the same time.
Yes, great tips. Thank you for bringing that up, Hector. I'm not seeing any other questions come through, so we can wrap up our session today. A big thank you to Hector, Craig, Leon, and Michael for all of your time, your insight, your expertise. We really appreciate it. We hope everyone found the discussion valuable and you're leaving with some practical tips and strategies that you can apply right away. Keep an eye on your inbox for a follow-up email, and that is going to include a recording of today's session. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.